May I first of all join the Leader of the Opposition in commending the work of his new honourable friend, the member for Kensington. I'm sure we can all remember our first few days as a Member of Parliament and getting to grips with it, have to deal with the disasters and tragedy of this sort in your constituency so early on. Must have been very difficult, but I commend the Honourable Lady for the work that she has done. The Right Honourable Gentleman raised a number of issues, many of which will be matters for the inquiry to get to grips with. So the responsibility in relation to this issue, some of the issues around, for example, the advice given by the fire service, all of these will be issues that the inquiry will, I would expect, to address. And as I said in my statement, we want to ensure that we're able to provide justice to the victims and survivors of this terrible tragedy that has taken place. And I do expect that the chairman of the inquiry or chair of the inquiry will produce an interim report so that we do see early lessons. I think it's important that as soon as we know that there is anything that needs to be learnt and addressed and acted on, that we know that as soon as possible and we take action as soon as possible. He referred to the issue of the Lakanal House coroner's report in 2013. All the recommendations from the coroner on the Lakanal House inquiry have been acted on. I think it's important to recognise that the Lakanal House inquiry coroner did not propose any change to the building regulations. There were issues about the guidance to the building regulations, but there were other issues that were raised, and all of these have been acted on. On the question of rehousing, we will be offering rehousing in the borough or in neighbouring boroughs. We have, as I said, got a significant number of properties. 164 properties have already been identified and are currently being looked at. A significant number of people have already been assessed for their housing needs. Some have already been offered housing. It is, of course, up to them as to whether they accept that or whether other properties will need to be offered to them. But that process is in hand, and I have set that 3-week commitment that people will be rehoused within 3 weeks. The tenant management organisation, which the Leader of the Opposition mentioned, is an issue that has come across loud and clear to me from my conversations with local residents. I think one of the first acts of the new Chief Executive of Kensington and Chelsea Council will be to look at that issue around the tenant management organisation and any action that needs to be taken there. And then the Leader of the Opposition referred to other instances. Hillsborough and the child sexual abuse inquiry were the two that he cited. I was pleased to be able to work with the families from Hillsborough. They should have had justice at a far earlier stage, but of course the issues are ongoing in terms of the Crown Prosecution Service looking at any potential criminal charges, but we have been able to provide the Hillsborough families with an opportunity for the truth, for them to know the truth of what happened to their loved ones, and for the public to know the truth of Hillsborough. I was also pleased to set up the child sexual abuse inquiry because I agreed, and as I said when I set up that inquiry, for too long people have made assumptions about certain people in our society and how they should be treated, and those assumptions are wrong. And we need to dig into that, and we need to find out why it has happened, and we need to change it.
Mr. Speaker, as the leader of a party which is responsible for 7 years of austerity, which has cut 56% of the cash available to my local authority in the last 7 years, and a leader of a party that has spent its time talking about regulation as a bad thing, is she now going to apologise to the country for the state of local government when the richest borough in London cannot afford to couldn't cope with this emergency, because at the same time as they were giving money back to their council taxpayers?
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the end of her compassionate and comprehensive statement, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, said that we had to think about the people living very different lives from ourselves. As I'm sure she knows, in opinion surveys going back over decades, People never said they wanted to live in tower blocks. And can we change public policy so that tower blocks can become a thing of the past?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that question. There are many people who do not wish to live in tower blocks. There are some people who are perfectly comfortable living in tower blocks. What we have to look at, though, is the approach that is taken to social housing. I think that is one of the lessons that comes from this disaster.
Maria Eagle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister confirmed in her statement that testing arrangements have discovered combustible cladding on some tower blocks in other parts of the country. Given that people who are living in those tower blocks are going to fear, perhaps more than others, the consequences of that discovery, what steps can she take to make sure that the landlords and local authorities where these tower blocks exist can swiftly deal with the consequences of that discovery?
Well, that work is already being undertaken. As soon as we identify, first of all, the testing work has been undertaken by local authorities, housing associations, and we encourage private landlords to do it too, of their blocks to ensure the fire safety. We encourage everybody to send in samples so that we can undertake this checking, lab testing. Local authorities are immediately informed if the material is combustible. They are then looking with their local fire services at ensuring the safety of those buildings. That will be done in a number of ways. But of course, there is a responsibility to ensure that people are housed safely, and the government is working with local authorities to ensure that.
Jenkin.
Commend my right honourable friend's statement and the extraordinary degree of personal responsibility she is taking in this response. Has she and her officials had the opportunity to look at reports by the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee and its predecessor committee under Dr Tony Wright, which have repeatedly recommended that the House of Commons should have more of a role in the setting up of such inquiries? And would you consider asking the House to establish a special select committee very quickly to look at the terms of reference, to give a pre-appointment hearing of the chair of the inquiry, and to set the budget and set the timetable and make sure that this public inquiry does have cross-party and public confidence in the way that so many public inquiries have failed to do?
My right honourable friend raises an important issue about inquiries, and of course we always look carefully at the reports of the PAC and indeed its predecessor committee. I think what is important in relation to this inquiry is that we do get it up and running with appropriate speed, and the most important thing to me is that the residents affected will have confidence in the inquiry. I think the key thing we need to do is to ensure that it is the residents who can feel that this inquiry is genuinely going to get to the truth for them.
Still waiting to hear the Prime Minister say that she will underwrite the costs to local authorities of inspection and urgent remedial action, given the cuts of up to a third and a half on local authority budgets and housing providers being required to implement a rent cut which has squeezed their budgets. We cannot have a postcode lottery in terms of safety provision, and that needs a commitment now from the government to underwrite it. Will she do that today, yes or no?
We are providing the testing facilities to the local authorities. We are working with local authorities to identify their needs and their requirements and the response that they need to take, and work with them to ensure that they can respond in the way that is necessary.
Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Leeds City Council have responded swiftly, communicating with tenants and residents in all 116 blocks, testing the cladding, none of which uses the same as what was used in Kensington. But what we now need to know, and following on from the question from my honourable friend, the member for Westminster North, is that whatever recommendations are made on sprinklers, on cladding, on fire alarms and other remedial work, that it will be central government that is providing the funds to ensure that tenants and residents in all of those thousands of tower blocks across the country are safe.
I thought I've responded on a number of questions on this. The government is working with local authorities. We will ensure that any essential works that are necessary in terms of remedial action for safety of these blocks in relation to fire are taken. We will work with local authorities to identify how that... We will identify... There will be different circumstances in different local authorities. We will ensure that the work can be undertaken.
Kerry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement that the Government will pay for legal representation for those affected by this fire at the inquiry? But can I ask her to confirm that this means that both victims and tenants' groups will be given public funding for independent and separate legal representation, sufficient to enable them to have a voice equal to that of local and national government and the private management company? I ask this question because I understand that the Tenants Association were not allowed legal representation in the Lacanau House fire inquiry.
This is, I say to the Honourable Lady that it's one of the experiences that came out of the Hillsborough inquiry was the importance of ensuring that those who were affected had appropriate legal representation, and the government did fund that legal representation to enable them to have the strength of voice that they needed in that inquiry. Of course, as she will be aware, how the inquiry is conducted and the witnesses who are called and the representations that will be received there will be an element of the judge actually deciding how he wants to conduct that inquiry. But for those who require legal representation, we will be funding that by the government, and I've not set any limits in relation to the types of body or the individuals who that would be.
Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has already been asked this question several times and failed to answer, so I'm going to give her the opportunity again. Will the government fully commit to meet the cost for proper and appropriate safety checks, to fully fund the recommendations and schemes for retrofit of sprinklers and any other associated costs?
I have answered it. I have made it clear. I've made it clear that where work is necessary, resources will be available to ensure that that work can be undertaken. But it's for the government to work with the local authorities to ensure that that takes place.
Alex Chalk.
Speaker, the families of the victims are entitled to the truth, not speculation, not conjecture, but the truth based on evidence. So my right honourable friend is absolutely right to set up the public inquiry. But can we ensure that an early date is agreed for publication of an interim report? On the facts of this case, perhaps more than any other, justice delayed is justice denied.
Minister.
I would hope and expect that the judge, obviously the individual will be independent, but I would expect that the judge, when appointed, would indicate publicly when they would expect to be able to bring an interim report out so that people will have that confidence.
Ms. Randy Slaughter.
Speaker, will the Prime Minister confirm that the 68 flats to be allocated to the victims of the Grenfell Tower fire on the Berkeley Homes Kensington Road development are already designated as social housing? What we need, particularly in places like West London, where social housing is the only affordable housing for many, is large investment in new affordable housing, not rearranging the same pot. And on these benches, we were very sceptical about her conversion to social housing until she starts providing that housing and not talking about it.
The important point about the Berkeley's home development is that it is being, if you like, ring-fence for people who've been affected by Grenfell Tower. That's the significance of this. It is available, and it will be available purely for people who have come from, who've been displaced and lost their homes as a result of this tragedy.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, many have paid tribute to the fire rescue workers who put their lives in danger and the trauma that they may still feel from that. I would like, as a surgeon of over 30 years, to highlight that NHS staff will also be traumatised, because there is nothing more horrific than dealing with the victims of burns. The autumn statement of 2015, the former Chancellor identified £800 million that should be taken from the new housing bonus scheme to make up the shortfall in social care. Will the current Chancellor now reverse that?
Prime Minister.
Yes. Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right. As I said, I visited one of the hospitals which had taken in victims, and obviously those NHS staff did a wonderful job as well. And of course what we've seen here in London is NHS staff not only dealing with the Grenfell Tower disaster, but also dealing with the terrorist attacks that have taken place. And as she said, it is those NHS staff deserve support, as do others in the emergency services that have been referred to earlier.
Residents of Grenfell Tower warned the housing provider of the dangers and that it would take a fire in a tower block for notice to be taken. Can I ask the Prime Minister to look at the Localism Act once again, which currently requires residents to give it 8 weeks before they can make a complaint to the Ombudsman for this to be taken up through their Members of Parliament?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising an issue which hadn't been raised with me before. I will look at the Localism Act. I think there are reasons why that period of time was put into the Act, but she's right that the issue of the response of the tenant management organisation is one of the ones that it has been raised and is one of the ones that needs to be looked at as the inquiry looks at the reasons for this.
Jack Dromey.
Mr. Speaker, fire sprinklers save lives. Can I correct the Prime Minister? Actually, the inquest recommended that the Department issue guidance to all providers of high-rise blocks that they should retrofit sprinklers. Can I ask the Prime Minister this? There's 213 blocks with 10,000 households in Birmingham. Will she agree now to act on the advice that was given 4 years ago, retrofit sprinklers and pay for it, government to pay for it?
Can I simply point out to the honourable gentleman that the recommendation was that the Department encourage providers of housing in high-rise residential buildings containing multiple domestic premises to consider the retrofitting of sprinkler systems.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister please tell us why she will not choose to show leadership and require all councils to retrofit the flats and provide the resources?
I have made the point earlier that what we need to ensure in any accommodation that is provided by local authorities or housing associations is that that accommodation is safe. People are making assumptions about the work that needs to be done to ensure that. What needs to happen on the ground is the local authority or the housing association, the landlord, working with the fire and rescue service to ensure that they can provide that safety.
Clive Efford.
Where an independent fire safety review of a block of flats recommends retrofitting sprinklers or major refurbishment, will the government fund it?
Well, the honourable gentleman's question seemed to talk about any blocks of flats in the country, whether they be in private or public sector ownership. What we are doing is making sure, first of all, that the fire service and landlords ensure the safety, local authorities and housing associations assess what is needed for the safety of those properties, and where action is needed and work is needed, the government will work with those landlords to ensure that that can be done.
Speaker, if Bristol Council comes to the conclusion that essential work is needed on its tower blocks, will the government fund that, and if so, how soon will we get the money?
If, in conjunction with the fire and rescue service, the decision is made that work needs to be done on those tower blocks, then there will then be a discussion between the authority and the Department of Communities and Local Government about how that work can be undertaken and about the provision of resources for that work.
Brown.
Mr. Speaker, in terms of paying more attention to social housing going forward, will the Prime Minister pledge to review the right to buy discount policy, the implicit message from government that renting is not aspirational enough, how the one-to-one replacement process is managed in Alligator Council House building?
To the honourable gentleman, if he looks at the housing white paper that we produced earlier, the government produced earlier this year, he will see that we were very clear that we expect there to be a diversity of ways in which people will be in their homes. Some will wish to own their homes, some will wish to rent their homes, some will wish to have rent to buy schemes, some will wish shared ownership schemes. What I want to see is a diversity that suits people and their circumstances.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask, an assessment is carried out as part of the inquiry into the capacity of the fire service to respond to incidents such as this, particularly with reference to crewing and high-reach appliances?
The fire service in this instance was able to respond to this, but of course when the inquiry looks at these issues I would expect that to be one that they would consider.
According to Home Office figures, the number of checks has fallen by 25%. These are the home fire safety checks since 2010. Will the Prime Minister now give the service the funding it needs to carry out 100% of the checks that are required?